possible and to ask you guys to ask us as many questions as possible. And I think by way of overview, I'm Gary Stewart. I used to be the director of Wayra in Spain. So we helped kind of create Wayra. When I started it, Julian was the first director in Barcelona, and now I'm running Wayra in the UK. And I think that what you see is that regardless of the geography, everything comes down to the metrics. So I think that to kind of understand why metrics are so important, you kind of have to put yourself in the place of an investor. Because right now, you guys, from an investor point of view, if you're startups, let me ask actually, how many of you guys are entrepreneurs? So we know who's in the audience. Entrepreneurs? The rest of you guys, who are you guys? Are you investors? People just interested in the sector? Okay, cool. So the point is that if you're an entrepreneur and you're trying to convince an investor to give you a few $100,000 of his or her money if it's a business angel, or a few million if it's a venture capital fund, the question is, why am I going to invest in you? What is it about you that is remotely interesting, given the fact that the way this business works is that I know that 90% of my investments are actually never going to return anything, right? And so I think that a long time ago, people were willing to base investment decisions only on, well, do I like the person? Does the idea seem really, really interesting? And then you start to realize there are lots of really interesting ideas, and there's some ideas that seem really, really stupid, but then they turn out to be big companies. So we can see like Twitter. I remember when Twitter started and people were saying to me, Gary, are you signed up to Twitter? I was like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. And then all of a sudden you start seeing the user numbers and you realize that actually it's not so stupid. Maybe it's something that you particularly wouldn't use, but it's something that a lot of other people are finding a lot of value in. I think maybe Facebook is another example. If you had said to most people after Facebook launched, well, MySpace just was bought for about 467 million euros. So why is Facebook all of a sudden going to become the dominant player in social networks? No one would have really believed it until they started to see the metrics that Facebook was able to generate. So I think the point is that nowadays, the only thing that we're really looking for when we determine if we're going to invest or not is, do you actually have probably a minimum viable product, something that you actually have out there in the market so that we know that you're serious about actually doing something, and are you actually capable of convincing some minimum amount of users that you have something that we should actually be paying attention to, right? And I guess a lot of this comes from the lean startup movement, which is this idea that if you can achieve product market fit, which is when 40 or 50% of the people that you're testing a product with actually say that they couldn't live without this product or they really find value in this product, then we know we're onto something, and that's when the investors are willing to come in, and that's when they're willing to say, okay, well, let me give you $200,000 of my money. I'm still probably likely not to ever recover that money, but now I know that at least that decision to invest is based on something, right? So I think that is the basis of kind of why we focus on metrics so much. If you look at the personal history, for example, of Wayra, you'll see at the very beginning, we wanted to invest in ideas on paper. And the thing is, you give like 40,000 euros to some entrepreneur that had a really cool idea, and then soon enough you'd realize that actually the entrepreneur didn't ever do anything with the idea, it didn't go very, very far. And we were losing a lot of money for Telefonica. So then very quickly we started to kind of pivot ourselves as an organization, and we said, we're only going to invest in companies that have an MVP and some initial metrics. And the way that we're going to structure our program is that from the beginning, when the startup gets in, we're going to ask the investors on the investment panel, what are the main risks that you think would prevent this company from being able to achieve global domination? If not global domination, at least product market fit. Once we identify what those risks are, then we figure out what are the metrics that would be able to help us identify that this risk has been mitigated. So like, let's say, for example, that you want to launch a social network, even though I guess no one is launching a social network these days. What would be the kind of metrics that we would be looking at to figure out if this was something that was a worthwhile investment? Well, maybe we'd look at kind of like how quickly it was growing in terms of user numbers. Maybe we would look at how often people return to the site. Maybe we would look at how often or how long they stayed on the site once they returned. Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to figure out is, what is the formula for determining if this business makes sense? What is the customer acquisition cost? Actually, how much does it cost you to acquire a new customer? what is the lifetime value of this customer? How much money can we actually expect to make from this customer over the lifetime of your relationship with that customer? And is that a positive number or a negative one? So if it costs you €8 to acquire a customer, and you figure that you can monetize this customer for €100, that means that you make €92 off of each customer. If it takes you a long time to acquire new customers or it's too expensive to acquire new customers, then it doesn't really seem that you have something that's really, really interesting, right? So the point is to understand exactly how that funnel is going to look like between acquiring customers and monetizing customers. And the only way that we can make any kind of actual sense out of that is by looking at your metrics. So I think that's by way of a background as to why any investor these days who I think is kind of serious is going to say to you, I have no capacity, because investors, even though they may try to BS and say to you that they have a unique insight into which companies are going to win and which companies are going to lose, that's actually not the case. Most investors are remarkably bad at figuring out which companies are going to be the winners in the market. The only thing that they can do to kind of hedge that a little bit is by looking at the numbers that the customers give them to validate that this idea is actually something that's interesting. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Julian, who might give us a little bit more insight into how we do this on a day-to-day basis in the Academy.
Okay, thanks, Gary. So I would like also to remind you that the most repeated phrase we receive when we know entrepreneurs that, yeah, well, we are convinced that this is going to be the next big thing. Of course, you have to be convinced of that, but also you have to convince us. And the only thing that you have to convince us are numbers, are metrics. So that's, again, that metrics that we need to know, and what's the traction you are getting, what's the engagement. Sometimes when we ask for metrics, people think on revenues, on money, and it's not all about that. It's also about engagement, as I said. So which is the funnel that Gary was talking about, to know what's the acquisition cost of that customer and how we can monetize that. Also, as we are investors, we also divide our investment in different tranches, and it's normal that an investor will divide the investment regarding milestones. So you put your KPIs, and also, for example, we split into parts the investment. So we first invest in a company, we set the KPIs with a milestones for the next months, and then we check. If you also have executed very well, or as you said, maybe the investor will put the money. But if you haven't executed as you said, the investor won't put the money in your company. So also to do that, it's interesting to do kind of a peer review with your colleagues if you are on a co-working space or an accelerator, to share the KPIs and how are they evolving. You have a question there? Okay. You were just saying hello. Okay. So also if you have a question?
I do.
Okay.
My question is the switch from idea to metrics, evaluation, measure returns, and measure returns increase.
Okay, so I'll answer that question. Yes. I mean, absolute returns in the sense of exits, I mean, we're still kind of very early in the exits phase. But I think what you start to see is that you need to think the way an investor thinks. And the way an investor thinks is that you are a mistake until proven otherwise. You are a failed project until proven otherwise. The only way to prove otherwise is by showing you the money, or if not the money, then at least the numbers. So what we've seen is that as we've chosen companies that have come in with better metrics and with a focus on the metrics, it's been easier to help them to get follow-on funding, or even to work with Telefonica. Because if, just because a startup gets into Wayra doesn't mean that it's automatic that the people within Telefonica understand the business case for working with that startup. Part of the business case for working with that startup is looking at the numbers and understanding how do users actually interact with this product or service. I think there's another really important point to make as well, which is that you as a founder actually have probably no clue how the market's actually going to use your service. And I mean, I remember when I went to it was the second Dublin Web Summit, where it was still kind of cool and they weren't charging startups all this money to attend. And Jack Dorsey was there. And so also was Chris Hurley from YouTube. And what he was saying is at the very beginning, when they launched YouTube, they thought it was going to be a kind of curated service for very artistic people, because Chad Hurley at that point had been studying kind of design within a university in the US. So he thought what he was going to do was to create a community for people like him. Then all of a sudden he saw that people were more interested in putting up pictures or videos of dancing cats, which I guess he could have never predicted. And that was actually what people wanted. So at the end of the day, what you need to do is to figure out what the customer wants, not what you think that the customer wants. And the only way to figure out what the customer wants is to test the customer and then to analyze those metrics. So of course, to answer your question shortly, once we realize that there is some sort of customer validation and that the customer validation is compelling, of course our investment becomes more interesting. I see one over here. So I think that the question of metrics is, there's no kind of generic metrics that you use in all cases, right? I think that if I were an entrepreneur, the way that we advise our startups, first thing is that you need to understand how your sector works, right? So if you look at kind of like the Silicon Valley kind of literature, what they'll talk to you is about kind of analogs and antilogs. If you're Facebook, there already exists a MySpace. There already existed a Friendster. Any business that you're creating, there already exists someone else who is trying to solve that very same problem, and they either failed or didn't succeed as well as you think that you could succeed. First, you need to study them, because I think the worst thing is when an entrepreneur comes in and says, I'm going to disrupt an entire sector, but I actually don't understand how the sector works. I don't understand who came before me. I don't understand the numbers that they had. I don't understand what stickiness looks like in that sector. So to answer your question, there is no general rule about what metrics. The point is it's usually very, very sector specific or area specific. And what you need to do is you need to come in with a profound understanding of what those metrics are and then show why you're better. Because the investor a lot of times isn't necessarily going to know your business as well as you do. And part of the test is to figure out, do you actually understand what this is about? Sorry? Come up here. Give us a 1-minute pitch and then let's figure out together what your metrics would be, because there is no universal rule to what your metrics should be.
The metrics?
Yeah, 1-minute pitch.
Of what I do?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. I'm a neuroscientist and I worked in behavior change and epidemiology study, and what we do is we calculate the impact of your behavior on long-term risk of chronic disease, and we do that with artificial intelligence. It's particularly lifestyle, so what you eat, what you drink, what you smoke, and how much you move. And then we help people change their behavior to optimize their health. That's what I do.
All right. So what I would say is, we've seen in the UK, at least, a lot of projects that are trying to do the same thing. Right now, kind of, okay, thank you for your pitch, by the way. We've seen a lot of projects, oh yeah, round of applause for coming up. We've seen a lot of projects that are also trying to do the same thing. Like e-health right now is really hot. Anything that's kind of like preventative is really hot. Anything that can kind of help stop obesity or anything that can lead to kind of, you know, diseases later on is really hot as well. Governments are spending a lot of money. So the first thing to realize is that you're not alone in that field. And the second thing to realize is that there are well-funded companies that are in that same field who may be a little bit more advanced than you are. So the question would be, in your particular situation, if it's a B2C application, the hard part is the psychological part. How do you actually prove that people are willing to use this, and not just use it the first time, but use it over and over again? So I would say that the metric that we would be looking for is recurrence. Can you actually prove that you can change behavior in a way that gets people to change their behavior, if that's what you're trying to prove? Which is the metric being, first of all, how many people actually sign up to this to confirm your hypothesis that they want to change? And then how many people actually stick with it, since the problem with diets and stuff like this is that people don't actually stick with it. And if you can prove that you've cracked that, then you have a good business. If you prove that you're another one of these fads where people say, like, it's New Year's and I want to lose weight, but then they kind of drop off in February or March, then you haven't cracked it, and you probably shouldn't get a second round investment. It would be the kind of how many people sign up, how many people stick with it, how do you monetize it? Are they willing to pay for it? Are they only willing to use it if it's free? It's those kind of metrics that we would be looking at to kind of figure out, basically, do we have a business, or is this just kind of hobby that you're going to have that's never going to scale to something interesting from an investment point of view? Okay. Any other questions? Why don't you get up here and do a 1-minute pitch about who you are?
No, it's actually just a question. As a former, investment manager, I'm used to evaluating projects based on cash flow metrics. So I see in the VC community it is a lot more about non-cash flow metrics, like all the ones you were talking about. So I'm very curious as to what's the rationale that connects non-cash flow metrics, like the one you were saying, to cash flow projections to eventually evaluate as an investment?
So I think the answer to that question is basically understanding what venture capital is. There's a reason why it's called venture capital. It's also called in Spanish capital riesgo. It's basically the money that you're willing to put for something that is a really difficult thing to monetize, right? So it's not a traditional investment. The point is it's an all or nothing investment. Either this turns out to be something that changes the world, or you just wasted the money, which is the reason why I guess most investors would only put a very small percentage of their portfolio, in the US about 5%, to this risk capital, right? So we're not looking for business. In Europe as well, you tend to see that people are much more focused on proving that the business model works. In America, no one cares. Like when Facebook launched, it wasn't really clear how they were going to monetize. It took Google 3 or 4 years to figure out where their business model was going to be. The point is, can you change the world? And then if you can, let's figure out how we're going to monetize that, because it will happen. That's the kind of theory of venture capital, as opposed to investing in an Apple stock or in an apartment. We don't really care about cash flow. I mean, we care about basically proving that users really want something or clients really want something. Yeah, we're betting big. We're betting on game changers, not on marginal improvements that have some sort of minimal additional cash flow.
But it's also on execution, because always if you can put whatever number you want on the Excel sheet. So if you want to do that projections on 4 years, okay, and then that's the valuation, nothing to do. Everyone can do it on an Excel sheet.
So are there any more questions from you guys, or should we continue? More questions? Okay, let's go over here.
Thanks. Just a quick question. You mentioned the importance of analyzing what the metrics look like in a particular space, getting to know if there are any particular players that have gone before you, getting a read on what those numbers may be like, and being involved in healthcare. Also, like one of the prior speakers that asked the question, I'd like to know, are there any best practices or advice on how you would go about analyzing what your the people that went on before you, what metrics they're using in order to acquire the knowledge to be able to follow up on that? And thanks for being here, by the way.
Well, thanks. So, I mean, in terms of best practices for figuring out, who's come before you, I guess one of the things that investors will be looking for as well is some sort of domain expertise, right? So a lot of the people who end up creating the biggest companies have actually been at this game for a while. So if you look at Nicholas Centrum, for example, Skype was his third attempt at peer-to-peer technology. If you look at Twitter, Jack Dorsey had been trying to figure out how to do these micro messages for about 5 or 6 years. The guys at Google basically had a PhD in this kind of... So the point is, you're not looking usually for people who have no clue how the industry works. That's kind of one of the first tests. If you come to me and you say to me, please give me 200,000 euros, and I say to you, how does the sector work? And you're like, I have no clue. I'm obviously not going to invest in you because you don't know what you're doing. And one of the biggest risks for entrepreneurs is, can they actually execute? I think this is a lesson that I learned myself when I started my first startup. I was a lawyer who created a company, and it was a kind of real estate search engine. And I was like, oh, I'm smart, so I can figure out how this works. And then there was another entrepreneur who actually had been working in classifieds, in an online classifieds for a while. And he was the founder of Trovit. You know what I mean? So the point is, he knew exactly all the tricks, the SEO tricks, what users were looking for, et cetera, and all he had to do was kind of figure out what had gone wrong in his last business and figure out what he wanted to do in this new business, where I was there still kind of learning how the game was being played. So I think a very important part of it is, if you're going to start a business, either you should know the rules of that game. Every business or every sector is a game, and the question is, are you a grandmaster or are you a novice? Or how can you at least recruit and hire the people who are grandmasters within that sector? If you can't do that, then your likelihood of being the winner of that domain decrease somewhat. It's not to say that you can't do it, it's just to say that it's going to take you a while you're figuring out what are the metrics, who came before me, how does this work. Someone else from the sector already has that part done, and it's like, okay, how do I get to the next level? And that time that you've lost is very crucial. Oh, sorry, but then to answer specifically your question, another trick that I did is a lot of companies, at least in the US, have IPO'd, right? Part of the IPO document, the prospectus document, is actually analyzing the entire market, everything that came before, what the major metrics are, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing that you can use are basically like press clippings. So if a company raised a lot of money and they have been published in TechCrunch or the Next Web or whatever, the newspaper's job is actually to analyze if this is a good or bad investment. So you can start to kind of like start reading up on your competitors. Go to Crunchbase, figure out every competitor that is doing something similar to what you're doing, read everything that exists about that competitor, read all of the critical analyses about that competitor. If that competitor got so big that they actually had an IPO, read the IPO document to figure out what are the risks that they are identifying to potential investors they may have, because legally they have the obligation to identify all of the material risks to their potential investors. That's the way you kind of start to figure out a bit more about how the sector is being played, in addition to having someone who actually is from the sector. All right?
In addition to Google Analytics, what are some good tools to use to track your metrics that you guys would suggest, just in terms of getting started outside of the...
So what's your company?
So I run a company called Wayra.
Do you want to come up here and give us a pitch? Sure. Yeah.
Hi. So my name is Devin. I run a company called Group Raise. We help restaurants host large group events, so typically between 20 and 200 plus people, in exchange for donating a percentage of the sales back to a charitable cause. We started that business in one city, and now we're in just over 50 cities, and we have 1,000 restaurants. And I'm really looking at how to go from 1,000 restaurants to 30,000, and instrumenting the project and coming up with metrics to help us successfully do that. We've raised a bit of money, and we've got our first $200,000 in revenue that we processed. And we're trying to go from 200,000 to 10 million plus.
So again, I think it would be very sector specific. What I would say to you is that when we're looking at our startups, we probably do use Google Analytics. But I think another thing that we try to foment with our startups is to talk to other startups who are in your same space, right? Probably if they're a little bit ahead and they're not entirely competitive, you can get a lot of intelligence from them. So let's say, for example, I have a startup that's in the same space. Maybe what they're trying to do is a health and wellness site for local businesses. So it's a hyper-local play, in some sense, similar to the one that you're doing. Then I would say to them, what are the tools that have worked for you? What are the tools that haven't worked for you? And then I'd put you two in contact. Because I don't think that there's a kind of definitive answer. It's just kind of what's worked best for some people and what haven't worked best. And the only way to know that is by asking other entrepreneurs who are currently in your same space. Does that make sense? So if you want to, after this, send me your executive summary. I will go through our portfolio and identify the startups that are in a similar space and put you in contact with them, and you guys should learn from each other.
Thank you so much.
Okay?
But also, normally, one more thing is that all the companies that we invested, it's not enough with the Google Analytics, and they put their own metrics panel. And also, well, take a look at, well, we'll talk of HubSpot, but we'll talk with a tool.
We built our own metrics tool.
Yeah.
And it just takes time.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see if you guys suggest something.
All right. So apparently we're being kicked off. They said that we've spoken too much. So if you guys have any questions, it's really easy. Like, you can send us emails, Gary, which is Gary, at Wayra.org. He's Julian at Wayra.org. And we'll stick around for a few minutes afterwards in case anyone has any other questions that we weren't able to address. But thank you for your time, and thanks for coming.